Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me. This presentation is about the events that occurred leading up to the American Civil War, during the war, and thereafter. This is sort of a part 2 of a video on this channel done in early February this year entitled, How the World is Being Legally Enslaved. That video spoke about how the powers that be use international law and deceptive sleight of hand with law jurisdictions in order to enslave the world through legalese and lawfare, effectively making you, a sovereign human being, into a product of maritime law or admiralty law or banking law. They use international pacts, laws, and treaties to do this. In fact, the law that gives them the primary authority to enslave us all into their court systems is the international law of the flag. And that flag that they choose to fly in those courtrooms and in the District of Columbia, which we'll speak on soon, is the maritime law flag, the one with the gold fringes on it. Yes, this hoax is a doozy, but it couldn't be quite that simple. Other things needed to be in place in order to maintain full control of all of us. Some seeming like by happenstance, like congressional failure or outright dissolution, a war that caused debt enough to topple a whole floundering country, or other more pre-planned and deliberate things like, of course, a few very specific laws enacted at just the right times. We could start in 1860. The Congress of the United States suffered a walkout of the southern states, which rendered the Congress of the United States sine die. Now, folks, sine die, S-I-N-E, space D-I-E, comes from the Latin for without day, meaning without assigning a day for a further meeting or hearing. Many scholars and researchers believe that the day that the southern states walked out was the day that the Republican and Democratic parties ceased to legally exist as political parties and have been doing business as the Republican and Democrat Party in name only. In name only means that its original intent of existence no longer exists, and the party's constitutions was severed from those respective political parties. From this point, obviously, the American Civil War had finally went hot, and years of death and destruction ensued. And by the way, folks, I can connect the Order of the Jesuits directly to this American Civil War, and I believe, once again, dear listeners, that this was a manufactured conflict just like most of the rest of them. Then, in 1863, still without a legitimate Congress, President Lincoln instituted martial law. He ordered that the states either conscribe troops and provide money in support of the North or be recognized as an enemy of the nation. This Martial Law Act of Congress is still in effect today. When the war was over, just as the Vatican, Jesuit, Zionist bankers had knew, America was in dire financial straits and was in need of some help. But a banker never simply just gives someone some money, not even if it is to be paid back with the illegal instrument known as interest. No, one must agree in many cases to some form of control for the lender, and in most cases must also provide some form of collateral to the soul-sucking bankster. So what was done next is the most treasonous act ever perpetrated upon the American people. The illegitimate Congress passed the Organic District of Columbia Act of 1871. The District of Columbia Organic Act of 1871 created a private corporation known as Corporation U.S. for the purposes of carrying out the business needs of the government under martial law. This was done under the constitutional authority for Congress to pass any law within the 10-mile square of Washington, District of Columbia. In said act, Corporation U.S. adopted their own constitution known as the Constitution of the United States of America, which was identical to the national constitution, which was known as the Constitution for the United States of America. And this corporation was incorporated in the city of London in 1871. And here is the scam. By instituting this D.C. Organic Act of 1871 that creates a sovereign country within a 10 square mile parcel of land and allows this entity to govern the 50 states, it becomes the perfect deception. You see, this area is controlled by the bankers, the Jesuits, the Rothschilds. This was their collateral for the bailout in the years after the war. and with its own constitution, and with the bankers in control of this parcel of land, and with this parcel of land now in a position of authority over the rest of the real country, then this becomes another jurisdictional sleight of hand that allows these bankers to control America directly through their control of the District of Columbia, through a layer or two of deception. And folks, why did they call this area the District of Columbia? Please do a dig on Columbia. Maybe start with this movie production company, Columbia Pictures. Find out who this lady is as their logo. And here's a hint. It is Lady Liberty. But that's not her real name, and that's not really what she's all about. But this would not be enough moving forward, so in 1909, this illegitimate Congress passed the 16th Amendment. Although it was not ratified until there were enough communists in place in Congress, and this was in 1913, and we'll talk much more about this infamous year momentarily. The 16th Amendment says that Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. And this, dear listeners, was the next treasonous act perpetrated upon America. During the first 100 years or so of this floundering nation, we generated revenue through tariffs, as the forefathers deliberately called for. The founders of this nation despised the international bankers because they were informed, learned men who understood full well the long-term goals of these devils. Nonetheless, this illegitimate Congress instituted this amendment to collect taxes on income, on your labor, on your sweat and blood. This is completely contrary to the original format that those geniuses had come up with. Tariffs in reality are the purest and fairest form of free trade. You see, if the citizens of a country like America are smart, skilled workers filled with pride for their work, along with a certain amount of ingenuity, as America has long been known for, American ingenuity, then it stands to reason that those citizens will create and manufacture the best ideas, inventions, and products, and this is factual if you care to study the Industrial Revolution. This is indeed what has occurred. And since this country was creating the best ideas, inventions, and products, then the rest of the world will definitely want them. And in many cases over the years, some of these inventions and products are really quite necessary for other countries to have, like the American inventions of electricity or the gas-powered engine, for instance. So these products and systems would be in high demand throughout the entire world. Thus, America can sell these products worldwide, and with charging a tariff on such items can generate revenue for the purposes of government businesses for the people. The same goes for any product from another country that would want access to the American market, the #1 market in the world, and it's not even close. With the American capitalistic system, what's left of it, citizens have a certain amount of wealth due to their work ethic and ingenuity. And an innovative invention that comes from, say, Russia cannot really make any money, as nobody has enough money to purchase it. So they must head to a market that has the money to purchase said product. And so in this case, this Russian product must pay a tariff in order to have access to this exceptionally wealthy American market. So as you can see, America with its capitalistic system is in a position to make money off of their ingenuity, because countries will pay extra for such exceptional products, and likewise they need to get their own innovative products into a market that can pay for the product. Truly the purest form of free trade, and the 16th Amendment stripped away all of these American advantages, and over the course of 110 years has stripped Americans of so much. In fact, I don't think that many of you out there really realize where America and us, the U.S. taxpayer, would be right now had they not been able to erode away a little bit of our wealth each and every single hour that we sweat in that factory or office or field over the last 110 years or so. It's truly, truly sickening. And the story goes that after 1871, this corporation, now free from any real constitutional oversight, then began to generate debts via bonds to cover the Civil War bonds that were soon coming up for maturity. Different from the various bonds issued during the Civil War, of which most were purchased by either Americans from the North or Americans from the South, these new bonds were issued internationally, obviously expanding the potential for raising funds. Now, many of these new bonds issued to pay old bonds were coming due in 1912. But these debts could not be paid, so the royal banking bloodlines that bought up the bonds demanded payment. Said families settled the debt for the payments of all of Corporation U.S. assets and for all of the assets of the Treasury of the United States of America. And per the District of Columbia Organic Act of 1871, and we're going to read some of that language here shortly because it's very important, but per this act, you and I are assets of this corporation. Assets are property, folks, and you want to know what else was and really is considered property even today? A slave is. A slave is considered property. Or an animal. A slave and an animal are the only two living things that can be considered property. And the same goes for most of the rest of the world, like in England, except the difference is they know that they're property of a monarchy, while the vast majority of ignorant Americans believe that they themselves are still free. So again now, as the story goes, as 1913 began, Corporation USA had no funds to carry out the necessary business needs of the government, so they went to said families and asked if they could borrow some more money. The families said no. Corporation US had already demonstrated that they would not repay their debts in full. But this was already clearly known in advance, and we'll briefly talk about that. The families had foreseen this situation and had the year before finalized the creation of the most significant scam ever perpetrated upon America, a private corporation with the name Federal Reserve Bank. Corporation US formed a relationship with the Federal Reserve Bank whereby they could transact their business via Federal Reserve note rather than with money. And notice that this relationship was one made between two private corporations and did not involve government, because this was the new authority acting on behalf of these United States. This was the District of Columbia using their new, technically unchecked powers. That is where most people err in understanding the Federal Reserve Bank system. Again, it has no government relation at all, and if I'm not mistaken, is ran by a foreign-controlled board of directors that are allowed to remain anonymous. And I believe that this is the only corporation that has that type of courtesy. And dear listeners, this was always the ultimate goal. The struggle for control of the world's money supply. This had begun a century earlier. However, reasonable heads had always prevailed, but this scam was a good one, as usual with these people. This began even before the American Civil War, and in fact, the American Civil War was a Jesuit, or behind that, we can say a Zionist, Hegelian dialectic operation with the ultimate goal being the foreign-controlled Federal Reserve Bank. Outbreak a civil war, incur gigantic amounts of debt, not be able to pay said debt when bonds matured shortly after the war. Enter the solution, a Federal Reserve Bank. To curtail the boom and bust cycles, making for a more uniform and less volatile financial system. And I've got something to sell you if you believe that mouth garbage that I just spouted. And this war, ladies and gentlemen, was once again drummed up by these people, as war is now and has always been a tippy-top way of controlling mass populations, as a defeated, stressed, war-weary person is so much easier to reason with, or should I say, control. And of course, these bankers knew that this war would be fought on both sides by the same country, the same citizens. It would be doubly detrimental to this nation, as this would be different than most other wars where one side, one country fights another country, each borrowing independently from other sources. The battles and ensuing destruction being distributed not only in one country but in both of the combating countries, but not in this case. The United States for America would be physically and economically fighting and funding both sides of the war, rather than just having to worry about one side or the other. They knew that once it was all over that they would be reunited and would have to deal with this debt as one nation. But America was quite strong after the war, and with industry like the Transcontinental Railroad exploding, could have paid these debts back, and hindsight seems to actually prove this. The bankers were well aware of this and had already set their plan in motion. It started with the D.C. Act of 1871. This was the first step. This allowed for a way to usurp the beautiful set of rules that those geniuses wrote up about 100 years before the devils got a hold of it. Once able to act more freely, they then attempted to get rid of the tariffs. Of course, as these Bankers were international businessmen who needed free access to the American markets. They knew, however, that this was how America primarily funded herself, so they obviously had a plan ready for that front. After an 1895 Supreme Court case called Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company shot down any sort of income tax being thrown upon Americans, the bankers simply illegally wrote an amendment to the Constitution, the 16th Amendment, that, among other things, allowed Congress to levy an income tax without apportioning it among the states on the basis of population. This, as just mentioned, was deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, as this form of revenue generating was highly unpopular still during this time, as the Satan sun worshippers did not have such control of the media and culture as they do now, and the electorate was much more informed on these types of issues back then. So after this Supreme Court case in 1895, the bankers ramped up their debt collecting game and began to request payments for the bonds that they bought that were issued by the U.S. in order to repay past Civil War bonds, and the bankers in control made the country believe that this was impossible. If you have time, this subject is a rather deep rabbit hole, but you should check it out. All the U.S. had to do was jump back on the gold standard, of which they had come off of for a time after the war, and this would have solved any debt issues. The U.S. could also have simply chose not to repay any Confederate States of America debt, as the debt was incurred by bad actors, insurrectionists who were illegally in control of those southern states. None of that happened. Going back to the gold standard did, but it was later and was too little too late, as the bankers had already purchased the majority of our lawmakers and had managed to create a fake panic amongst the nation. Upon actually researching the events and atmosphere during this time, we can easily see that this debt should not have resulted in such panic and paranoia, but those in power back then, the same as those in power now, are damn good at what they do, dear listeners. Damn good. They had successfully created a situation out of thin air. Does that remind you of anything that happened in 2020, folks? They had successfully created a situation whereby Americans, along with Congress, thought this debt to be insurmountable. And so we now have a need for the 16th Amendment. Never mind that the Supreme Court considered income tax as unconstitutional. The country was scared out of their wits, as they hadn't seen or heard of debt like this in their lives or the life of this young country. The bankers once again used fear in order to take away your God-given rights, and just as they had planned, the amendment was passed by Congress in 1895. But even with their sophisticated, for that time, mass population control, it wasn't enough to ratify this amendment, as there were still enough lawmakers or powerful political figures who still had half a brain and who were not bought off or blackmailed yet. And so over the course of the next 17 years, the bankers used all assets at hand to eventually get their golden goose. They hampered the U.S. with more and more debt by sternly standing firm with regard to repayment of the bonds that were issued to pay the war bonds, while keeping the U.S. in a situation, like not canceling the CSA debt, for instance, where they could not repay these bonds. They choked and choked this great nation until late 1912, early 1913, when the bankers officially got their income tax, and just in time for the events that were coming later that year, the most consequential year in America's history. With the ratification of the 16th Amendment in February, the ability to collect income tax, the Luciferian Jesuit bankers wasted absolutely no time. In October of 1913, now with a nice fresh amendment to the Constitution, the Revenue Act of 1913 was passed, significantly reducing any tariff activity while also slapping a 1% tax on income above $3,000 per year. And this was a real killer for Americans and their future posterity. 10 weeks later, the globalist shill Woodrow Wilson then signed into law the Federal Reserve Act on December 23, 1913, effectively ceding control of the country to the Zionist bankers. This, of course, another fraud perpetrated via these people, just as they did with the 16th Amendment, as the sole authority to coin money lies with Congress per the original national constitution for the United States of America. So how have they been able to do this? It's a jurisdictional deception, folks. It's no different than how they have managed to legally enslave the world through lawfare. And again, you want to check out another video on this channel entitled How the World is Being Legally Enslaved. We are being unwittingly placed within legal jurisdictions of which should have no authority over us. And they use international laws, pacts, and agreements to place us within these jurisdictions. Before we conclude, let's briefly read through a few things in the District of Columbia Organic Act of 1871. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United District of Co-States of America in Congress assembled, and quickly folks, representatives of the United District of Co-States? I've never ever heard that representation before in my life referring to America. Continuing. The District of Columbia shall remain and continue a municipal corporation, as provided in Section 2 of the revised statutes relating to said district, and the commissioners herein provided for shall be deemed and taken as officers of such corporation. Now, let's stop right there for a second. First, you can see that it is a corporation as it is stated so clearly, but it is a municipal corporation. Now, municipal is defined as first having local self-government. And this one from Cambridge. Restricted to one locality relating to the government of a city or town rather than the government of a country. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the District of Columbia is a municipal corporation, and a municipal corporation is local, like in a city or town, rather than the government of a country, per the Cambridge definition. But the District of Columbia is acting as the central governmental authority for the United States, and this cannot be if this entity is municipal. As the Webster's Dictionary example states, a municipal is a local authority that is established by the larger government to handle issues in that local area. We are told and led to believe that the District of Columbia is the United States government seat, the authority that establishes and enforces the laws, but by definition, this cannot be. This is the jurisdictional sleight of hand, folks. Just like they've done to us in our courts, and I'll leave a link to this act because you really should read it. It's a very, very significant act, as you will find. Interestingly, it speaks quite a bit. I'd say almost half of it pertains to taxing the citizenry. The other half seems to read like a transference of authority or allegiance from one entity to another, and as it should be, as this is exactly what this act did and is doing. With no constitutional authority to do so, Congress created a separate form of government from the District of Columbia. Essentially, what is happening here is this. The U.S. government was under the authority of the original Constitution, known as the National Constitution, the one that reads the Constitution for the United States, not of the United States. That is the phony one. So to get around this, a few things needed to be done. First, they used jurisdictional deception to establish a government entity within a government entity, the District of Columbia. On the surface, this is not such a big deal as long as everything is done using the original Constitution. But to now seal the deal, they managed to change the rules. And it's really easy to understand, actually. It's no different than how they hide their control of business or organizations through layers. Layers of parent organizations. Like how ESPN is owned by ABC, which is owned by Disney, but yet, if one isn't paying attention, the previous two seem to be sole independent organizations. This is true in the case of the District of Columbia Act. The international Jesuit Zionist bankers wanted control of America, but they had to get around that pesky Constitution. So the plan, as usual, is quite ingenious. They would create what they call a sovereign governing authority, a piece of land within the greater country that would have sole authority in governing the states. Now all they had to do was take control of the laws of that smaller, more manageable, newly created authority. And let's stop here quickly. Has anyone ever thought through what exactly this District of Columbia is? The national capital? Okay, fine, but so why the need for acts and laws that give this area some special form of governments all spelled out in that Organic District of Columbia Act of 1871? This country was already a country for about 100 years by this time and had previously had capital seats in Philadelphia and New York. Why was this one so different that it needed a 5-page law written for it? Layers, ladies and gentlemen, and muddying the waters. Precisely what these folks do best. So the next move was to take control of this newly created authority. Now that it's all quite confusing with special sovereign lands within sovereign lands, but understand that this was 100% by design. Finally, the bankers would get their sticky, greasy, sulfuric-laden hands on the Constitution, as it would now be copied, or should I say rewritten, to reflect this new sovereign authority. This seems ridiculous, as too many eyes would be watching, but it wouldn't take much. Essentially, the whole original national Constitution didn't need to be changed at all. It just simply could fall under maritime law or admiralty law, or also known as banking law, as long as the subjects under the authority of the Constitution are considered maritime property, or simply just property of the state. Once the citizenry, assets of this government, and the government itself are considered to be property of the District of Columbia, and you control the District of Columbia and its laws, then you've got it all. And this is exactly what has occurred. As the story goes, by changing the beginning of the Constitution from, quote, the Constitution for the United States of America to the Constitution of the United States of America, then you successfully changed the Constitution from governing a country and its people to a Constitution that governs a corporation, and everything within the scope of that corporation is considered property. And this includes we, the people. And they have extended this into the courts also. And again, please check out the video on this channel entitled How to Enslave the World Legally, to better understand maritime law, banking law, and how they can use jurisdictional deception in order to effect authority over us. Now, with regard to the 19th president scenario, this DC Act of 1871 was not put into effect until immediately after the 18th president, Ulysses S. Grant, left office and Rutherford B. Hayes took over in 1877. And so the theory is that all elected officials, including the president, along with all government business, after this act was implemented, are all null and void, illegitimate, fraudulent because of the change to the Constitution. Meaning that the last legitimate president of the United States was the 18th, Ulysses S. Grant. If you enjoyed this presentation, please like, share, and subscribe, and consider supporting this channel on Patreon. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching.